Welcome to Enterprise and Investigative Journalism. This week, I've got a real treat for you because I'm going to show you a man with a big old stack of hair. That's me about 30 years ago when I was a newscaster and reporter for a television station in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, what we're talking about this week is using the internet during investigations. Now, back in those days, we didn't have the internet, but believe me, I'm going to be able to tie all these ideas together for you here in just a bit. The closest we got to having the internet back in these days was a thing called a scanner. And on this device, you would program the call signals of police, fire, rescue, air traffic control, Coast Guard, and anytime they were communicating, headquarters, if you will, communicated with their officers out in the field, it came over this device, and you were trained to listen to this while you're doing your other job to pick up on breaking news stories. Well, one morning as I'm preparing the morning news and I've got this on in the background, I hear a call from the Charleston International Airport indicating that a plane that had taken off from Columbia, South Carolina and was flying toward Charleston had disappeared off of radar, and they were trying to find this plane. Well, as I reported the story and kept in contact with police and fire and rescue and air traffic control, we came to find out that the aircraft had not only disappeared from radar, but in fact had crashed. And as we continued reporting as the morning went on, we found out that not only had there been a plane crash, but the pilot of this plane was a very influential person who lived in the Charleston, South Carolina area. So we went out to the crash scene investigation and found all the information about what had happened as best we could at that point. It was the same day as the crash. And so our job then was to report it. So to show you how this works, we got the tip or the idea. In this case, it came off the scanner, and we did what we're teaching you to do on our EIJ reporting flowchart. We found out whether it was real or rumor. Well, it certainly was real. We got the official response, and we reported the story. And so typically, that's the end of the story. But while I was in the field covering the crash, I introduced myself to the agent in charge of this crash scene, who was representing the National Transportation Safety Board, and their job, it's a federal agency, and their job is to investigate, obviously, anything that happens with transportation, especially crashes. And because this is a federal government agency, they are open and must share with you information to the Freedom of Information Act. So I got to know the guy who was in charge of this report, and he and I would stay in contact over a span of several weeks. As he was investigating, I would follow up with him and gather more information. And one thing that was curious about this particular air crash was something wasn't adding up. From the time the plane left Columbia, South Carolina, until it crashed in Charleston, South Carolina, there was a huge gap of time that we couldn't explain from the time the airplane took off in Columbia to what's roughly 100 miles or so down to Charleston, South Carolina. So through our reporting efforts of checking with the National Transportation Safety Board and some of the people there in Charleston, South Carolina, we found in fact that the plane did not take off from Columbia and fly to the southeast to Charleston. In fact, it took off from Columbia and flew northwest into Greenville, South Carolina. It stayed on the ground in Greenville, South Carolina, and then later on that same morning, the plane reappears on the radar, and then it flies back to Charleston, South Carolina, gets lost in the fog, and then it again crashes. And so what we had to then piece together was, why did he fly, instead of Columbia to Charleston, why did he fly up to Greenville, stay there for a little while, and then fly back? And as we began digging deeper into the story, we in fact found out what had happened. And I got a mysterious phone call right before we were getting ready to report this story. And the voice on the other end said, "We know that you know why this person flew to another area, and we would ask that you not report the story because of the impact it would have on his family." So what would you do in that situation? Would you report the story or not? Now, I have never reported that, and I won't tell you right now what the situation was, because we made an editorial decision not to report that part of the story. And we can certainly debate whether that's proper journalism or not. So let's just walk through how this went. We did what we're training you to do. We got our tip. We confirmed it through official response, but instead of being the end of the story, this is when we started doing our own research and really trying to vet this story to find out what actually happened. We did our research and our documentation. We had interviews with victims and experts, in this case, the National Transportation Safety Board and others. we did a survey of similars. That's how we found out that most planes, when they take off from Columbia, South Carolina and come to Charleston, South Carolina, there's a certain time frame it would meet, and this plane was beyond that time frame. And that's what tipped us off to keep digging deeper into the story. And once we put all of these facts together, we then had an opportunity to go back through all of these folks, the National Transportation Safety Board and the folks that are involved with this particular victim of the plane crash, and we ended up with, in fact, the investigative story that we decided editorially only to report parts of it. So here's what your assignment is for this week. You're going to read Chapter 4, Investigating Internet or Using the Internet During Investigation. You need to review your enterprise and investigative journalism reporting flowchart. You're going to be responsible to be able to mimic that and know the flow of an investigative story. And then now you're going to get your chance to do your own investigation of an actual National Transportation Safety Board report. It's called Their Last 8 Minutes of Life. And that's your writing assignment for this week. And we will see you next week back here on Enterprise and Investigative Journalism.